Thank you for joining us tonight. We have Dr. Angela Yang-Handy here, who currently serves as the Dean of Global and Experimental Engagement at NMH and is responsible for directing both the Center for Learning Through Action and the Global Engagement Office. As Director of the Global Engagement Office, she oversees international student support and services, NMH's array of study abroad programs, and the provision of globally themed events. Angela holds a doctorate in educational policy and leadership with a specialization in international education from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and an MA and BA in international development and social change from Clark University, and a graduate certificate from UMass Amherst in advanced feminist studies. Angela first came to the United States 24 years ago as an international student from the Philippines. Her experiences as an international student, and more recently as an immigrant, have continually informed her work with international students and families over the course of her career. While Angela has studied and worked in international education most of her adult life, she has also coordinated programs in service learning, multicultural student affairs, admissions, residential life, and academic advising. Prior to NMH, she worked at Clark University, Landmark College, Keene State College, UMass Amherst, as well as a range of educational institutions, for-profit businesses, and community-based nonprofit programs in the United States and abroad. Angela's recent publication, Introduction to American Life for High School Students, A Guide to American Culture, Adjustment, and Engagement, was published in July of 2018 by NAFSA, the Association for International Educators, which is known as the largest professional organization in the world for international educators. Aside from her most recent publication, Angela has worked as the lead editor of a 355-page book entitled Project Mom, Our Natural Approach to Motherhood, which was published in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Angela.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I'd rather sit, but I think that we have guests that are kind of dialing in, if you will, dialing in before, linking in now. As well, so I'll stand here for the benefit of the camera. I am so excited to be here. I worked on this project for 8 months last year, and it was really such a great opportunity to think about our work with international students, and even reflect back on my own life, both as a professional working with international students, but also having been an international student myself when I first came here. Like Justin said, 24 years ago, it seems like it's almost a quarter century. So that's a significant amount of time. And so I'm really excited to share again a little bit about the book that I wrote. But there were a few things I was hoping to do today. Just that I thought I would take the opportunity to talk about the global context and within which international secondary students are coming to the United States and also traveling across the globe for education in particular. Talk a little bit about the booklet itself, and then kind of relate it to the experience of international students here at NMH. So, just to start, there are two pieces of research that came out just in the last few years that have really been groundbreaking with regards to international student migration. The first was called Charting New Pathways to Higher Education International Secondary Students in the United States, and the second called Globally Mobile Youth, Trends in International Secondary Students in the United States, 2013 to 2016. These were both produced by the Institute for International Education, and which is really a premier organization, been around for decades, and they do a lot of really great work programmatically, but also research in particular around international education, movement, programs, and so forth. And so these particular reports were actually written by a woman named Christine Barubia. One was written in 2014, and the second one just came out in 2017. What was really groundbreaking about it is that in the first 2014 report, she talked about the significant increase and rise in the numbers of international students moving for secondary education in particular around the globe, not just in the U.S., but around the globe. And that the numbers globally between 2004 and 2013 tripled. right? So there's this huge rise. So it really created the ground level set of data and information numbers that allowed for the second report in 2017, where she documents that from 2013 to 2016, the numbers continued to increase, but the rate of growth had slowed down. So I'll show a little bit more about that. And all right. So there were some findings in the 2017 report that I'm going to talk about. The first is that international secondary numbers, like I just talked about, continue to grow but at a slower rate. But what's important to note, so this chart I pulled directly from the report, shows that the top four, what she called the Anglophone countries, that are receiving students from all across the globe. The United States has been and continues to be the #1 destination country for students secondary students traveling. But actually America, for generations, for decades, has been actually the #1 destination, period, for immigrants. People move for all sorts of different reasons, but the United States has always been retained its status, if you will, its position as being the #1 destination country. So that continues to, her research demonstrated that, where these are only numbers of secondary students, school students. And so you see in the United States, from 2013, there were 73,000 students. By 2016, it went up to 81,000 students. And that's a significant, steady growth, and it's continuing. And then the next closest to it is Canada, with only 40,000. So America continues to draw the largest number of secondary students. It's also true, actually, for post-secondary students, America being #1, in the world as well. The other thing, again, this just says that the growth has slowed, but it's still happening, right? The second thing I wanted to talk about was that in her study, she talks about two categories of students, and those include those in the F1 student visa and the J1 student visa. There are 185 different visa categories in the United States, and each one of those are governed by different regulations, and also are governed by different government bodies. So the F1 visa, for example, falls under the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically the Student Exchange Visitor Program. And these are the kind of students that we have here. The international students are all in the F1 visa. The J1 visa actually falls under the Department of State. So what this chart tries to demonstrate for us is just that is regionally how it kind of has fallen from her research. This was a national and a global data set that she used. 78% of the F1 students in America are from Asia, 9% are Europe, 8% are Latin America and the Caribbean, and then 6% are from other countries, right? And that's kind of how it falls. When you talk about Asia, that's a huge region, right? But that's how she kind of categorized the groups. For J1 students, and I should say that the F1 student visa is really predominantly for a degree-seeking group of students. So they actually want to enroll at a school and graduate with a degree. The J1 students are here on cultural exchange. That's why it's managed by the Department of State. And so you see, when you talk about the relationships between countries and the agreements that they have, that then drives students from certain countries to come on the J1 visa, and that's a different purpose for coming to America. And they're also usually shorter term periods. So 67% are coming for that cultural exchange versus a degree-seeking set of students, and they're from Europe, right? Again, 22 is from Asia, 3% is from other, and 8% are from Latin America and the Caribbean. So each visa has a different purpose. The largest rise that's been documented in the data are for students who are coming for who are degree seeking. So these are secondary students who are coming here explicitly so that they can have better access to universities and colleges in the United States. The access and admission, I won't talk about admission rate, but the admission to higher education for international students, for everyone in general, but international students in particular, has become more and more competitive. And largely because there's such a rise in these numbers, but it's also become the driving force for students to come here earlier and earlier. So I became curious and wanted to know what it looked like here. You know, how did we kind of match up with these numbers? Again, we have F1 students. So I looked at our current fall numbers in our students, and what I found was that 75% are from Asia, 7% are from Europe, 8% are Latin American and Caribbean, and 10% are other. So it was actually striking to see how similar the pie ended up looking like. For our numbers, we have 145 on the F1 visa. That's really a large number. When we talked to our field representative in the Department of Homeland Security, who comes to visit us once a year, she was just, we had our annual kind of check-in recently, and she was saying that we really are amongst the largest populations of international students at this level for any secondary school. So that's significant to acknowledge. And also our breakdown, I just put some numbers there. You know, Asia is 109 students, Europe is 10 students, Latin America, Caribbean is 11 students, and other is 15. So I should say we have 23% of our student body are the F1 visa. But if you actually extend to students who are dual citizens, who are third culture kids, you know, who are permanent residents, then we actually are looking at 32% of our students who are international in a broadly defined way. But all of this data and this whole, what we'll be talking about here today is really about F1 students who are here on what are considered non-immigrant visas rather than immigrant visas with the intention to stay. Because these visa categories are defined for people who the government expects will leave, right? So just some background there. One of the other findings as well from the research is that students from China continue to drive the growth in international secondary students in the United States. And so this just shows, you know, China's the red, South Korea has been going down, that is this purplish thing. Vietnam is on the rise a little bit, Mexico and Japan is steady. And part of it, of course, is that there are different policies and laws that regulate how many can leave and so forth, you know, amongst other reasons, which can affect these numbers as well. But, you know, China has continued to drive the increase. And again, this is just about secondary students, and so you see that large rise there again. And also at NMH, our Chinese students are among the bigger groups of students that are here as well. So, you know, if I actually did this comparison, which I didn't get to, but if I did, we probably would be seeing something very, very similar. As a little tidbit about NMH, when I first came here 5 years ago, we had 46 countries represented. Now we have 57. And admissions told me at the time during my interview, right, that there was an intention to get to 64 countries in the next few years, which it seems like they're really on their way to do it. And so what is interesting to me with this purple line of South Koreans going down is that in general, the number of South Koreans coming to the United States has been decreasing. And years ago, NMH had depended heavily on South Koreans as a big population amongst our international students. And unfortunately, with the Asian currency crisis that happened, we lost many, many of them suddenly. And that was really, really tragic, actually, for the institution because of the dependence on those students, and it was a large number. And so I think that has had an influence on our overall enrollment policies as a school, you know, not to rely on any one country too heavily, because we really aren't in control of the external things that are happening and contributing to, you know, the rise and fall of these numbers. So these numbers are just showing trends, but it's always interesting to stop and ask ourselves, well, what's contributing to a flat line, you know, a dip or growth? So just something to think about. And then finally, this piece, this will all come together in relation to the book in a minute, but it talks about how more secondary schools now enroll international students, mostly in the private sector. So what this figure shows us is, you know, some of the top areas or leading host states, and the breakdown between private versus public schools that take in international students. All of these schools have to be certified, again, by the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of State to have J1 or F1 students. And the top 3 states with the largest F1 populations are California, New York, and Massachusetts. Now, if you put together J1 and F1 students together, it actually, the top 3 states are California, New York, and Texas, right? because again, just the sheer number of those students, and that largely there's a connection between the university system and how robust their international student draw is for the post-secondary level, right? So it's just interesting that we actually made it, as in the top 3, and we're schooling that as well. Okay, so NAFSA, you've heard about NAFSA, which is the Association for International Educators. This is directly from their website, right? It's the largest nonprofit organization in the world dedicated to international education and exchange. And again, it's got 10,000 members located at 3,500 institutions in more than 150 countries. It's massive. And they've been paying attention to all this research. They've been paying attention to these trends because it matters that they are serving the international population. And these are all educators, right, and students. So they've been paying attention, and that's really what, this is the booklet that I wrote, and I was invited to write largely because they realize there's such a need. And so this is not the only thing that's been going on. My booklet was part of a series that they've come up with, and other colleagues wrote. One is about U.S. high schools, which is really more about the academic experience. The International Parents Guide to U.S. High School talks, really attends to parents' needs and interests around this stuff, but largely also talks about the visa information. There's a lot there to understand. It's really the role of parents to really manage that process in many ways. So, this is just to say that this is a big thing that's happening in the world, and these trends, were so important that, the need for these booklets kind of were born out of that, right? Okay. So in writing this, this publication, and I have copies, so if you want some later, you get free ones since you're here tonight. And they're here in the library as well for checking out if you're interested. And so, these are common things when you look at literature broadly, professional literature, research literature, even the websites of schools and universities, which is mostly where this information is located. There are some key issues that are commonly experienced by international students. And so these are the academics, so the personal adjustment, travel concerns, immigration. And then this is more pertains to NMH, right? Working with international families or social or secondary students as well. It's a whole different kind of engagement with, with students. It's beyond them, it's a family. And so that really informed my work. But the piece that I wrote, the booklet, really focused more on social, personal adjustment concerns. And so those are some standard things that I was kind of referring to. All right. So that again is what led to, this is kind of, there isn't actually a table of contents in the book, but if there was one, these would be the topics for it. The goal of writing this book was just to make it light and easily accessible, because it's really designed for students themselves. And it's a really broad overview. So imagine any one of you going to a foreign country, to another country, even a community, NMH, right? There are certain standards that kind of define this place or another place that you're not familiar with. And so it's not a tourist guide, but it's almost meant to be light, fun, encouraging, but realistic to some of the challenges. And it is written, I was asked to write for an audience that included all internationals from all countries. Students at all sorts of different kinds of schools, regions all across the country. So when you think about the wide diversity of what I was asked to cover, you can't really be so specific. These are really broad strokes in terms of addressing some of these very, very complicated issues. But the intention was just to introduce some key ideas that would get students knowing where to go next, and also just feeling that it's okay to realize that things aren't familiar to you, and then how your feelings kind of, what comes from that. So I've highlighted or bolded some of the areas that I just want to mention a little bit and tie to NMH and the experience of students here. So this big behemoth of an issue of American cultural values, so complicated. I read so much, and I think about this to try to understand it myself, realizing that having been an international student myself and a recent immigrant, I really did not know how to talk about this in a way that felt authentic initially. And so I read so much, and it ended up being 1 or 2 pages, right? And that's a whole piece here. But what became really important was to distill the information for really high schoolers in a way that would allow an understanding that there are these 3 big areas, that there's so much more to learn, and there's no time or justice I could give to them. But one is individuality, and how that's so important, and it is a cultural perspective. Free speech, how that's something that's so valued and important here, and yet there are limits to what free speech means, context, and protecting the rights of others. And then the issues of equality as well, that equality is a value that is so ingrained here and important to uphold. And understand, really, because we have students coming from countries where, firstly, their collective cultures, I'll talk about in the next slide, and what that is. Free speech isn't a right, and equality, there are questions of, again, different laws and policies and circumstances. It's not they don't live in countries where equality is a standard. That's a guiding principle that informs policy and practice and culture. So those are just 3 very general values I talk about. I go into a little bit more depth in this idea of individualism versus collectivism. This is just a quick image that talks about, that kind of illustrates really some of the ideals behind it. And this is actually something I took from the book that I wrote, which you'll see when, again, the discussion of cultural archetypes, just one way that it's, these distinctions, these opposing viewpoints are defined in the literature, are often kind of polarized and represented in charts like this. It's a very, very common way to do it. But I tried to pull some of the key contrasting points that would be applicable to kids, right, and to a school experience. So, thinking in terms of I versus we, or individualistic cultures are those where the importance is placed on independence, self-awareness, and self-advocacy. I mean, how often do we reward students and encourage students to be self-advocates? You have to advocate for yourself to get what you want, what you need, right? But that's not necessarily something that's valued or practiced or encouraged or learned for students from certain countries. Again, when you're from a collectivist culture, importance is placed more on interdependence, on group awareness and mutual relationships. So again, when you start to understand and go down all these different pieces, you're talking about having a mindset, a framework, guiding principles, behaviors that are taught and learned, rewarded, or punished even. And if you come into any new situation where you have those guiding this is how I'm supposed to be, and all of a sudden you're learning new things that are positive, seen positively, that may be even counter to what felt right, what you understood was right, not just feeling, but understood was right. It can be really, really disorienting. It can be a huge challenge. One thing I just wanted to also mention is that the unique perspective and original opinions are valued under individualistic cultures. We see that playing out in our academic integrity policies. So, understanding that that's an area where a number of our international students kind of really don't get, and they struggle with. And so the way that I kind of try to explain it to our international students that struggle with this is that it is really a kind of learning the rules of the game. There are mechanics, there are ways to do it right, and it's really learning what those rules are. But often students that are challenged by this say, well, why? I don't understand. Because typically, if they're coming from a culture where the expectation is to promote and follow the group's perspectives and opinions, and they're rewarded around being able to regurgitate things verbatim, and that is the measure of success, doing things right. It's just such a different kind of transition in the way of not just how they think, but how to do things correctly, right, and then be rewarded or not. So anyway, this is actually really, really important. It's one of the areas that are kind of not always, doesn't always come to the surface as the reasons that our international students, some of them, can really be challenged and struggle here, but it's one of the core adjustment issues that if you're trying to trace back where it may be coming from, it can be from, again, these cultural archetypes. And again, there are some regional examples because they're regional, and there's, even if the students are from certain countries, there are such differences within, so it's important to talk about that. Diversity and identity in the United States is something I go into the book as well. I really have appreciated my time at NMH because I think that the way that we've talked about diversity and identity has really deepened my thinking about how, and the numbers of international students we have with such diversity too, deepened my thinking about what this means. And so, identity, we talk about, having multiple identities, talking about, intersecting identities. There's an ideal in America of encouraging students to explore their identities and talk about their identities out loud. And I think those can be just ways of thinking about yourself in an individualistic way that, again, could be so counter to something that students are familiar with. So I was reminded as I was preparing for this of Chaewon Carey Kim's Founders Day speech that she gave last year. She graduated last year. I was really struck when she actually spoke. But then again, thought to pull it up. But one of the things she said here is, my 4-year stay at NMH as an international student was characterized by a successive chain of identity crises. I wrestled with the task of molding my sense of self in a way that appeased both the Korean and American cultures while simultaneously striving to break free from the predefined norms that accompany each. So, and then she goes on, and I will read this because it's so powerful. Before, when she was in Korea, I was protected, I was protected by the safety of assuming the identity assigned onto me as a result of my foreign status. I used to believe that my English reflected my degree of assimilation, that because my English was fraught with holes, my sense of place at NMH and by extension the U.S. was also far from permanent. This meant I could always fall back upon a version of self that remained unmarred by my romance with English, whether I felt isolated or misunderstood, the version of self whose allegiance belonged to South Korea, my homeland, and therefore detached from the complex cultural transitions taking place within me. She goes on. If you have the chance to pull this up, it is powerful in light of how complicated the process of identity and learning about oneself is. For this age range, yes, already it's something the kids are working out, but I think in particular, using the constructs of race, of ethnicity, of gender in the United States can be really, really complicated for kids that is just not something that they're familiar with or coming to. There's also the sense of where's home? All of a sudden they're beginning to take on and understand and feel connected with issues or ways of thinking here that, and challenging ideas that or ways of being that were encouraged at home, right? And so because there's something to compare to, they are coming to their own kind of place to think about this stuff. And so that's just a huge thing, and I really, other than others, when I was in higher ed and working with international students, there wasn't this complexity and nuanced way of thinking about this experience as much as I've seen here. So I've really appreciated students' openness, talking about their challenges related to this, as well. So it's been, for me, an education. And I'm always just wondering how I can be more supportive of students, kind of speaking to that. Because there isn't one answer, right? Perceptions of identity in the United States. That's an area that's interesting because I really was able to come up with these 4 perceptions, and I'll just read it from here. It took me a long time to figure out how to say it. That, again, came from talking to students here. So, it's the idea that, there are perceptions of identity in the United States that they may experience and try to work out and can be kind of an effect of them. So one is, you may come from a more homogeneous country wherein you are a part of a majority population, but in the United States you may be considered a minority. So it can be an adjustment to realize that you are perceived differently by many others around you. So that's kind of like a ha moment for some, or it could be more dramatic for others. Another thing, if you speak English with an accent, some people may make assumptions about your education or intelligence, or think that you are new to speaking English. This may be true even if you come from an English-speaking country. Another perception of identity in the United States that again strike a lot of international students. You may primarily perceive yourself as a person from a specific country of origin, tribal affiliation, or ethnicity, but after arriving to the United States, you may find that other people perceive or refer to you primarily based on U.S. racial categorizations. These may be labels new to you, and you may not have previously identified yourself using these categories. So when I came to the United States, I was from the Philippines, and all of a sudden, people would call me Asian. And then I was like, oh, okay, and I'm half Finnish, right? So I had this biracial identity growing up in the Philippines, but came proudly as a Filipino. And then all of a sudden, it took a while to realize that, oh, other people are calling me Asian. And so then I started to, over time, kind of identify more and more so that is, a big part of how I self-identify today. But it took some time to really kind of find my way with that, and my sense and my comfort. And then the last thing that I've heard a lot from students, you may be asked to represent or speak in public about a wide range of issues related to your country. The assumption is that since you are from a certain country, you must be fully knowledgeable about your country and culture. While it can be an honor to be asked to speak as a representative of your country, you may also feel uncomfortable or burdensome because you are put in the spotlight. If you agree to speak, you should know that there's nothing wrong with not knowing the topics you're asked to speak about, and that you can do research on them. So I have talked to students about this, and I also experienced it. When I was in college, I had somebody randomly call me on the phone, with the phones then, in my room, and ask me if they could interview me about the drug trafficking problem in the Philippines. And I said, I know nothing about that. But, it was just interesting that somehow I was a walking resource for all things about the Philippines, right? And it was just kind of I think about it as a funny story, but there are all sorts of versions of these kind of things that I've heard time and time again from students, from colleagues, from friends, that I experienced myself. These are just some topics that I talked about in the book. You don't have to go into them at all, but largely, over the summer, faculty at NMH read a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching. And Hermon wrote about the idea of indirect directives, right? And this is something that's really, really important because, some students can come from cultures like the U.S. is, where, being direct is important. And others, kind of are coming from places where indirect conversation is more kind of the norm. So there is a practice in America. It's something I learned, it's something I do. And when I moved to the Philippines, I was here for 15 years, moved back to the Philippines, and then came back after 5 years. While I was in the Philippines, I had to undo my indirect directives because I lost people all the time. They didn't know what I was talking about. And what that is that, it's the suggestion of, you might want to consider this rather than do this, right? You might want to consider perhaps editing that essay and putting in this stuff. So for an international student where that's not how they're thinking, they may then read it as, oh, so I don't have to do it. When actually a teacher is trying to say, no, you've got to do this, right? So indirect directives. So, another piece is this, idiomatic expressions and slang. So, all the time I get students saying, what's this mean? I don't really know, I've heard so many times. Something that's related to that, in terms of not idiomatic expressions, but expressions. I was at a conference presenting around this stuff as well just a few months ago. It was a diversity, equity, and inclusion conference. And at the end, someone came up and talked about her experience with her students, where a group of these students, for a year, they've been in for a year or so, one day just finally said, we've been trying to work this out and we haven't been able to figure it out. Which is that, they wanted to know what "aw" meant. They had no clue what "aw," and they gave all these examples of what that meant, right? And so I see, looking around, that we have a sense here of what that means. But again, it's context specific. So a cute little kitten, and you're like, "aw," right? But if you don't really have the context, or why would you even do that? Those are all kind of part of learning. space, place, conventions for communicating, which can totally throw people off. But also what's important is that leads to the next one, friends and relationships. For international students broadly, as we experience and hear here in NMH, feeling like you get people, or that people get you, right? And so part of it is related again to language, to expressions that are used and so forth. But the number one desire for most teens are, peer group is so important, making friends. And for international students, there's such a desire across the board, but it's also one of the biggest challenges for all sorts of different reasons. And a lot of it can be related back again to cultural difference. You're just not understanding behavior, right? You take this step and you expect someone to take the step with you. But when they're going the opposite direction or doing a different thing, then you start wondering what's happening, right? And a lot of that experience kind of can really jolt your sense of confidence, what to expect, your role in social situations, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And really all you want to do is make a friend, right? So making friends is really a big challenge. Feeling isolated is one of the biggest things that is commonly experienced for international students all across the post-secondary, secondary level, which of course leads to depression and isolation. So the mental health issues are pretty significant for a lot of international students. And all I really say, the other two I want to mention here is that dating is not a required thing in America, right? So, you look at High School Musical and other, things like that. There's an impression that I've had conversations with a number of national students over the years. There's always some relation to something they've seen on TV or whatever, but it is that conversation that it's not a required thing, and there may be religious or cultural kind of different expectations, and it's important to know that they can be supported to do what feels right to them and natural. And then the last thing I threw into this section of family relationships was the idea of time etiquette, right? Which is really, really important. If you have a more relaxed sense of time, you don't need to be somewhere because that's just how it is and that's accepted and expected where you're from. Understanding that, in America, it's be 5 or 10 minutes early, then you're on time, right? There is that kind of idea. And so, it is a question that or an issue I've had to talk with a number of my international advisees about, not all, but definitely it's noteworthy, and parents as well, right? And so having to understand, we're not just bridging language barriers, we're bridging cultural, barriers as well. So they can speak English completely well, but not really understanding the reason, for these things. So anyway, there's a lot there. The biggest point of emphasis for both the other slide and this one is I've tried to normalize attending or going to counseling, asking for help, because I think, again, that can be really problematized depending what culture you're from. It can be here in the United States as well. But as much as possible, throughout the book, I tried to just encourage reaching out, try to work against the isolation, and know that counseling is very, very normal here. Health and wellness, this is just kind of some areas that talk about food, sleep, physical activity, sports, puberty, sexuality, body image, and mental health. And that, social situations can be very different from what you're oriented to or familiar with. Some students are coming from countries where the drinking age is much lower, if there is one, right? Or it's not enforced if there, even if there is one, and so forth. And so that's a real adjustment. We've had students who have all sorts of addictions, actually, that have come, and, or even smoking and so forth, and it's just so familiar. And so if they're not if they don't come prepared to understand not only the legal issues around that, that it's against the law at their age in drinking alcohol, definitely substances and so forth as well. They can be struggling with having to work through an addiction, while they're here, and then keeping that secret, and so that just creates all sorts of different problems. Not huge, but it's definitely happened with some of our students. And so so it's just, I'm not going to go into the details here, other than when we're talking about body image, one of the things I bring up in the book is that it's not taboo to talk about, or very, very taboo, depending on where people are coming from. And that food is one of the #1 things that our students continually miss, which is why the International Carnival here is really powerful and important. Kids go so excited about that. But again, just when you think about even changing the kind of food that students eat, when they first come here, if they're familiar with certain types of grains or whatever, and all of a sudden that's stopped, which we do a better job here for sure in dining hall, but that changes your body. So imagine what you typically choose to eat, and your body's familiar with ingesting those and processing them, and you automatically change entirely the basis of what your body's familiar with. It can actually lead to psychosomatic and also physical kind of reactions to your body, which we've seen with students who then, are lethargic, they're just not feeling well, they just feel off, right? And so we've all been in that situation where you had something that is off, or just too much of something that's unfamiliar. It happens for our study abroad students. We go away, all of a sudden we're like, some students say, I need some spaghetti. I need a burger. It actually happens. And I think part of it is your body not kind of having just a transition and change, right? But it can lead to all sorts of mental health issues, and comfort and isolation and depression. So it's important to understand the health and wellness cycle that our students here do experience. Okay, so just wrapping up here. We've had international students for eternity. And Peter Weiss was kind enough to dig through and find some pictures for me. But, there are a few international women here, and we've had students from Sweden and Canada and Japan and China and Korea and on, Germany, Sweden, since our earliest days. And so we've had a commitment at a school, and it's been really, I really feel personal pride, professional pride being at a school that has had this long history and commitment to supporting our international students. And of course, here are our global ambassadors this year, here up to the late night NMH on stage. Just happy and celebrating. And, I wasn't able to pull the survey results of a small little survey that the Global Engagement Office that we did last year in detail, and I think we can probably work on our questions a little better. But, the feeling overall is that our students do know where to go for help, that they feel supported by faculty, by the dining hall. There was definitely a big spike there, by the counselors, by their coaches, their dorm staff, which is really, a good feedback for us as a school. And yet, I think it's important that that we recognize that in all these different ways, there are challenges that sometimes we often don't see, that some of which are similar for teens experience, but there are some things that are really unique for international students that have some crossovers, with students of color on this campus, but not only, so there are some unique areas that we can continually learn more about in our interest of supporting international students more. So that's all I had. It's a big overview. Are there any thoughts, questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So going back to one of the earlier slides about where you talked about the numbers of international students coming to the United States and other countries, and your dates were like 2000 something, 13 to 16.
This one?
So how do you think the 2016 election will affect those numbers? Because there was a huge, when that election happened, there was panic.
There was panic, and I think that what we've heard from actually NAFSA and some other documentation is that we've had students from certain countries that feel targeted. The numbers have gone down. We had some students who said they were targeted for similar reasons, concerned about Trump and not feeling that they wanted to be here right now. There's the You're Welcome Here, hashtag You're Welcome Here movement that started at colleges and universities, that some secondary schools are more and more beginning to consider, as something that they want to do. So I think that the political conversation and climate right now is having an impact on families, thinking differently about where to go. There are certain, so there's been significant or more of an increase in the numbers going to Australia in recent years. Some of the rate of growth that's slowed for America has been attributed to students choosing to go to other countries. So some of the other countries like the UK and Canada and Australia in particular. So I think we're going to need time to see how these numbers actually continue to grow, level off, dip down, which is why it's so significant, I thought, to contextualize the timing of this book in the context of the research that's beginning to be gathered. And I'm really hopeful that we'll see more around those comparisons in a more longitudinal way to see how, and maybe the report, both reports don't really go into a lot of detail around the contributing factors for at least the change that we're seeing in the rate of growth. But it would be interesting if there was more qualitative studies to understand what are affecting choices for destination. Long answer, but it's just to say that we don't know in full. Anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think that schools, post-secondary schools, schools broadly, communities are recognizing the threat to this America feeling like a place where international students, international people, immigrants feel welcome, right? And I think that's where these movements like #You're Welcome Here have really emerged from. And that's where it's really gotten more and more support and attention in the media and so forth. So like Donna Aram, the head of NAIS, which is the National Association for Independent Schools, which is one of the premier professional organizations for independent schools, had put out a statement a few months ago, just to say, as an organization representing secondary schools, independent secondary schools in America, we stand by the You're Welcome Here movement and effort. So, hope that.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, questions? So I encourage you, I get so excited about numbers and research, that helps inform my thinking about work, and I still like school a lot. Stuff. So if you're interested in seeing, this research, it is really interesting to see the patterns and to understand that there's such, what else is going on around the large number of interest still of international students globally to migrate, and a majority for education are coming into what are considered Anglophone countries, right? These countries here. And so we really, we are the social justice school, so we talk about, our historical inequities in the world, colonialism and so forth. And so what is it about this long history that has had an impact on the enduring today perception that schooling abroad at these particular countries are going to afford students from these countries more opportunities into their future. There definitely is, from the Philippines, speaking from the Philippines in my experience and people I know, basically have left with the intention to go back, some of them, or myself to stay here, right? Love happens in the end of staying, and all sorts of other reasons. But still, there is that pull of the opportunity that is above and beyond what you may be able to attain at home. And what does that mean, really, in terms of the development, for your family, and supporting them and so forth. And so there are a lot of questions that I think would be interesting for us all think about, pursue further, independently or together, if we're interested, around what's driving, what are the conditions that are driving an interest for increasing numbers of students to go abroad for school at earlier and earlier ages. Because now we're also seeing an increase, not yet in a report kind of in research way, in middle school kids, right? So coming really, really young to America, in the ages of 8 or 9. Right? again, when I talk to parents, what I understand is that it's, they want the best opportunity. And it's getting harder and harder to get the higher education, so start earlier, learn the school system, stay on, and stay on. So that's what I've understood.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.